Slow build-ups in games can work really well. They set up whatever game they are a part of nicely and add a sense of mystery and excitement to the game. Games that have a cinematic edge tend to go for the slow burn approach to ease you into their world and get you familiar with the mechanics and characters within it. Some people call slow starts boring. These people are boring. A steady burn prevents players from getting overstimulated straight away when booting up the game. Nowadays we often see developers use this in their games. Some even decide to make their entire games slow, steady and really boring. Then you get those developers who don't believe in taking things slow. One such developer is Tripwire Interactive, a small company who started out their venture into gaming by developing games that started out as mods for Unreal Tournament 4. One day, Tripwire approached a young Alex Quick, who at the time had created a very popular mod called Killing Floor, and Tripwire wanted to turn that mod into its own full-fledged game, and the result was glorious.
Wankers!
Killing Floor is the complete opposite of a slow build-up. The game cuts out all the traditional video game tropes and just tells you to go kill some Zeds. If you are someone who hates slow starts and or has ADHD, then Killing Floor and its sequel are perfect for you, as immediately when you load up the game there's no waiting around, no massive intro cutscene or scrolling credits. You can just jump straight into the action. Killing Floor fans know that a third installment was announced last year, and so with nothing to do with my life, I decided to buy both games. £2 bleeding for a game? That's less than a pint of Carling down the old boozer, my son. Sorry, this game just brings the British right out of me. And all this time I thought Zombie U was the first prominent British zombie game, when it was actually this co-op masterpiece. I don't use that term loosely. Killing Floor and Killing Floor 2, for what they are really great games. Despite the premise of a co-op zombie shooter being so simple in theory, it's easy to forget just how many developers have managed to completely mess up this goated formula. But these two games do it effortlessly, and on a far smaller budget. You could just label both games as being mindless fun and move on, but that's boring, and not necessarily the case. Sure, you could take one look at a clip out of context and be like, holy shit, what's going on? But if you actually take the time to look past the complete clusterfuck, you will find a couple of games that aren't just fun, but also incredibly unique. Surprisingly, there is actually a story to these games. In London, a dodgy scientific research company is busy experimenting with cloning and DNA manipulation for military purposes. Of course, the experiments go horribly wrong and the cloned creatures turn on their creators and break out of the secret lab, killing civilians and any armed forces sent to stop them, eventually taking over London and its surrounding areas, led by their leader and former human, Dr. Kevin Clamley, now known as the Patriarch. The government didn't like this very much, and so decided to send in squads of military personnel and any surviving police officers to fight back the Z threat in and around London. Probably one of the first times in zombie fiction where the police and military are the ones saving humanity. Most of the time they just miss every bullet and die immediately. The story isn't necessary, it just adds context as to why you're fighting Zeds on a farm or at a fairground or at a demented old school. We as the player take control of one of these capable and not brain dead military personnel, and you can even change your appearance to one of the many characters available to you. You could go for one of the generic army dudes, but that's pretty boring. Why do that when you can be a robot, a giant chicken, a football hooligan, a little anime fella, or even a guy that shits money? Granted, most of these skins have to be bought with real life money, but everything's actually fairly priced. It's not like one of those games where you have to fork out almost £20 for some skins that were once free. With any co-op horde based game mode, it's important that the gameplay loop is fun and addictive, because if it isn't, that shit gets old really quick. The main gist of the gameplay in Killing Floor is that you and your squad, or just you if you're a loser, have to survive waves of Zeds that grow in number and deadlier variations. Every bullet counts, and you have to be careful it isn't your last, otherwise you're pretty much screwed. You start round one with a pistol, knife, a healer, and a welder, but it wouldn't be any fun if these were the only tools you had to kill zombies. That's where the illustrious trader comes into play.
They're all dead! It's time to go shopping!
At the end of every round, this sexy minx opens up one of her shops to you for a whole minute, and if you can't get there in time and you've got no ammo, guess you better start getting handy with that knife. This is where you can choose from a vast array of weapons, so long as you have enough dosh.
Not enough dosh for that one, hun.
Yeah, you don't get handouts around here, sunshine. You need to kill zombies and survive rounds to accumulate dosh, so you can buy the best of the best weapons, like dual Desert Eagles, massive shotguns, and a potato. Another element of the gameplay is the class system. Before Before a player spawns into a game, they choose from a number of classes that grant them special bonuses when killing Zeds. Each class has weapons that are linked to them in the trader shop, and the only way a player can level up their class is by killing Zeds and completing specific challenges with the guns from that specific class. This doesn't mean you can't use other weapons from other classes, but it does mean you won't be leveling up your selected class anytime soon. There's also a ton of DLC weapons for you to buy, but most of them are just guns already in the trader store with a different camo.
Oh look, it's painted gold, isn't that neat?
Seeing all the guns available to you may make you want to go around buying all of them, but unfortunately, guns are heavy, and you can only carry so much.
You're off your rocker. How do you think you're gonna carry that one?
This at least encourages you to play around with different weapons and see what kind of class you like the most. The trader shop also lets you buy armor and grenades, which you will need on the higher rounds as the Zeds become increasingly deadly. When launching into a game for the first time, no matter what difficulty you are playing on, the first few waves are pretty easy, to the point when you think killing floor will be a piece of piss to beat. Then you immediately get humbled by the sheer amount of enemies that are coming at you. The way you play only really depends on what map you are playing on. The classes don't really make a difference to how you play, besides the medic class, as you have to do the same thing for every gun you use, aim and shoot. Certain maps are pretty spacious, encouraging you and your squad to constantly be moving. Other maps are a lot more claustrophobic, which have plenty more places where you and your squad can hunker down and hold choke points. To help with this gameplay style, each player is granted a welder that lets you weld doors shut, keeping Zeds at bay for a short time before they inevitably smash it open. You also need to adapt the way you are playing depending on what kind of Zed you're fighting against at that time. The number of Zeds on the map at once varies depending on how many players there are. If it's just you all by yourself, most of the time you'll be fighting 30 to 50 Zeds for most of the waves. If you've got a full team of 6 though, then that number is massively increased. From minute 1 you are fighting at least 100 Zeds. Most of the Zed army consists of clots, frail gimpy little fellas that walk slowly and do very little damage on their own, but like anything can be devastating in large numbers. Crawlers are the next weakest enemy, but they make up for this weakness by being extra creepy. These guys are humans crossed with spiders, turning them into these gangly little weirdos that crawl on all fours and leap at you. Bloats are big bastards that act as walking bombs for the Zeds, as they explode when shot, which sends bile flying over any player close to it. Plus they can vomit on you, which is kind of a trend with fat zombies. Gorefasts are a little bit stronger than clots, but they can actually deal some moderate damage with their massive sword arms. Stalkers are cloaked enemies that only reveal themselves when they attack you, but you can usually detect them when they start whispering in your ear. These are the enemies that are pretty easy to deal with. They can of course be dangerous in large numbers, but compared to the other Zeds you meet, let's just say it's like fighting a blind man versus fighting Bruce Lee in his prime, not while he's dead. Sirens are essentially the support class for the Zeds, as they don't physically attack the player but rather scream at you, which deals damage, slows you down, and can destroy grenades that are thrown at them, making Sirens a very useful asset to the Zed army. Sirens probably have the most creepy design in killing floor too. I mean, just look at that face. Husks are one of the few enemies in the game with a ranged attack. They launch flame mortars at any player they lock onto, which eat through your health and armor. These guys tend to make camping very difficult for you and your squad, much like the next guy who goes apeshit when you shoot at him. Flesh Pounds are arguably the strongest and most devastating of the normal enemies. They deal tons of damage when enraged, which can basically end your entire game if you aren't too careful. Despite being one of the strongest enemies in the game, they're nowhere near as scary as Skrakes. Skrakes are probably the most iconic enemies from Killing Floor, which is probably down to their horrid design, and the fact that they can wipe out your entire team with just a couple of chainsaw swipes. Killing Floor has a vast array of monsters for you to fight, and so does Killing Floor 2, but I'll get into that one a bit later. Once you have finally beaten all of the waves, a sense of pride washes over you, but the sensation of pride quickly turns into piss dripping down your leg when the Patriarch spawns in. The Patriarch acts as the final boss of each session. He can turn invisible, use melee attacks, and shoot the piss out of you with his massive minigun strapped to his arm. This guy takes massive amounts of punishment from you, and even when you think you might be winning, he can just one-hit you out of nowhere. Despite this premise being so simple, it remains engaging for hours upon hours, and I put that down to the game having such a fun and strange personality. From the get-go, you know that the game isn't graphically great. That's not me having a go at Tripwire, I'm just stating a fact. But what it lacks in looks, it makes up for heavily in charm. A big reason for this is the inclusion of community-created content in the game. There are tons, literally tons of maps that you can play on that all have their own unique quirks, collectibles, and identities that make them feel different from the last. You can even join community-made game modes that are all incredibly unhinged. Killing Floor leads into the over-the-top, cheesy aspects of zombie flicks, with its vast array of weird maps and custom game modes, and it shows a great relationship relationship between the community and developers. This can also be seen with the holiday events and the free add-on that turns Zeds into killer toys in a dollhouse. It reminds me of games like early Halo and Little Big Planet, where the player base is encouraged to work with the tools of the game, and there's even mods available to download for the game too. In the nicest way possible, Killing Floor looks and feels like a bunch of assets thrown together. It feels like you're inside one of them Gmod RP servers, but then you remember you're in the UK, thanks to the same voice actor voicing every character in the game. With a small niche indie game like Killing Floor, you don't expect the soundtrack to be anything special, but like many iconic indie games, the soundtrack is arguably one of the best parts about the game. The soundtrack was composed by Synthetic, a freelance musician who was along for the entire journey of Killing Floor, as he also composed the score for the original mod, and he went incredibly hard with the full game. It's one of those instances where the soundtrack heightens the gameplay to a whole new level, as it makes fighting waves of Zeds with randoms online so much more satisfying. Satisfaction seems to be Killing Floor's main goal, which is probably why there's a slow-mo feature. This is triggered randomly when killing Zeds, and it allows you to fully indulge in watching their heads pop like melons. I also really enjoyed the scuffed aesthetic of the game. The voice acting isn't anything to write home about, but there's something so charming about tutorials being written in red Comic Sans, and ammo glowing like some kind of power-up. While some people may say it makes Killing Floor look amateur, you have to remember that the game didn't have that big of a budget, and these little quirks make it stand out amongst other horde-based games. It's obvious people loved it so much because they made a second game that improves on a lot of the first game's flaws. Nah, flaws is a bit harsh. Basically, it just makes the core elements better. Killing Floor 2 released in 2016, 7 years after the first game, and immediately you can see that time and money were both well spent on taking the franchise to the next level. Set 1 month after the events of Killing Floor, the Zeds have now spread out of Europe and further across the world, causing major communications between countries to break down. Just like before, you are part of a special Zed killing strike force, instructed to wipe out any and all Zeds you come across, while also completing other smaller objectives on each level. The gameplay of Killing Floor 2 is basically the same as before, with a few additional tweaks that help smoothen out the experience, and even evolve it. Combat is still slick and satisfying, with gunplay feeling a lot more accurate and responsive. The most major change to the gameplay is probably the overhauled class system. Though Killing Floor's classes were a nice addition, they didn't have much effect on the overall gameplay, but Tripwire took the right steps to ensure the class system did have an actual impact on gameplay this time around. Leveling up your classes is made a lot less grindy in Killing Floor 2, though you still have to use specific weapons assigned to your chosen class to level it up. The process is a lot quicker, and simply killing Zeds with these guns grants you XP. This makes the gameplay loop feel so much more rewarding than it was in Killing Floor, as you actually feel like your character is getting stronger the more you play. Sticking to a class is also much more beneficial in number 2, as for every 5 levels you reach, you are able to pick a talent for that class. These talents can affect the weapons you use, or even grant you bonuses and class-specific abilities. Killing Floor 2 overall makes you feel a lot more capable in the fight against Zeds, even letting you run this time around, instead of just making you waddle everywhere like in the first Killing Floor. Dosh is still needed to buy nades, armour, weapons, and even upgrades for your weapons, but the trader has been replaced by a pod. No, how could you take her away from me? The trader voice varies between maps. Most of the time it's the new trader, but sometimes she is replaced by map-specific characters, like Lockhart on his airship. All of these upgrades are essential in the fight against Zeds, especially since they are stronger, and there's a few new additions to their ranks. All the Zeds from the original Killing Floor return, and this time they have more variations that spice up encounters on the battlefield. Cysts are the new punching bags of the Zed army. They are frail, blind little bastards that stumble towards you and act as meat shields for the rest of the Zeds. Looks like Clots moved up the pecking order, as they are no longer the weakest enemy in the game. Killing Floor introduces a stronger version of the Clots in the form of slashers. These specially modified Clots have a much less frail appearance and deal more damage with their sharp claws. Gorefasts also have another variation called the Gore Fiend. These guys have a blade on each arm, making them twice as dangerous as their one-armed brethren. Tripwire decided that crawlers alone weren't creepy enough, so they decided to add elite crawlers that have acidic blood. Quarter pounds are smaller versions of flesh pounds, and act as a funny play on words. Everyone's favourite Zeds are back and badder than ever, and not only are they a lot more deadly, but they're also a lot smarter, as they can block attacks and even evade oncoming fire. Killing Floor 2 also introduces non-organic enemies into the mix, as now you get to fight EDAR bots. Apparently Zeds don't mind robots, unless your name is Dar, so they fight side by side, which is a dangerous combination, as one excels at close range attacks, while the other shoots the piss out of you from afar. The Patriarch in Killing Floor was probably the most intimidating enemy to look at in the game. He was the be-all and end-all of every session, and he makes a triumphant return, now with brand new friends. Adding variety to the final boss was something only possible through modding in the first game, so having multiple bosses this time around was a nice touch, as it adds a little bit of unpredictability to the maps. The bosses also have their own unique attacks and behaviours, meaning you can't use the same tactics on each of them, and much like the Patriarch from the first game, these guys can mess you up in a matter of seconds. Killing Floor 2 looks more like a traditionally and professionally made game, however the charm from the first game is thankfully still intact. The updated graphics gave Tripwire a lot of room to make the Zeds even creepier and grotesque than they were before. There's actually more than a handful of voice actors this time around too, which makes chatter in the game a little less repetitive. It also makes the characters in the game feel more like actual unique characters, rather than just British NPCs. Customization is available for each of the characters too, allowing you to edit their appearance and give them accessories if you so please. Stuff like this significantly adds to the replayability of the game, and while the first Killing Floor did make you want to keep playing, the sequel gives you more benefits for playing the game. The soundtrack kicks ass once again. Synthetic returns to the sequel, along with some other artists, that helps set the mood for a bloody and violent experience. You could argue that Killing Floor 1 and 2 don't have a very engaging narrative or characters, but honestly who cares? The games don't need them. Their biggest strengths come from the ideology of delivering fast-paced action that's almost impossible to take your eyes off, and they both nail this. Tripwire mastered the art of not making their games overly complicated and sticking to what they know their fanbase loves. With Killing Floor 3, it's important they keep things simple. That doesn't mean they can't be adventurous, like having characters say more than 2 voice lines, but as long as you keep the combat addictive, the music badass, the Zeds creepy, and keep the community heavily involved, then Killing Floor 3 will be another cult gem.